Hey everyone. Ever wonder what happens to all that CO2 we exhale? I mean, it's gotta go somewhere, right?
It does. And it's a pretty amazing journey, actually.
Yeah, that's what we're gonna deep dive into today. This physiology handout by Dr. Rasha Eldeeb really breaks it all down. CO2 transport in blood.
Lots of cool chemistry going on.
I know, right? Like our own personal chemistry said, only way cooler. So Dr. Eldeeb starts by talking about this concept of tidal CO2.
Oh, yeah, tidal CO2. Basically, think of it as the amount of CO2 that has to be moved out with each breath.
So it's like extra CO2,
Yeah.
above and beyond what's just always there.
Yeah, exactly. It's the difference between what's being carried in the arteries versus the veins. Venous blood's got a slightly higher CO2 load.
Okay, makes sense. So then how does our body deal with all this extra CO2?
Two main ways. You've got physical solution, which is basically just dissolving directly into the blood.
Like sugar in water.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Only about 7.5% of that tidal CO2 is transported this way.
So if dissolving isn't enough, what else is there?
Well over 90% is converted into other forms. That's where the real magic happens.
Chemical transformations. Sounds a bit intimidating.
Oh, not at all. It's super elegant. The majority, about 68.5 to 70%, is turned into what we call bicarbonate ions.
Bicarbonate, I've heard of that. Doesn't it have something to do with keeping our blood from being too acidic?
You got it. We'll get to that for sure. But there's another player here too. Carbamino compounds. About 25% of that CO2 ends up bound to proteins, mainly hemoglobin, to form these carbamino compounds.
Wait a minute, hemoglobin, isn't that the stuff in red blood cells that carries oxygen, so it's multitasking?
Totally. And here's where it gets even cooler. The amount of CO2 that can bind to hemoglobin is actually influenced by how much oxygen is already there. It's called the Haldane effect.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What is this Haldane effect all about?
Well, basically it means that deoxygenated blood, the blood returning to the heart from the tissues, can actually carry more CO2 than oxygenated blood. Makes sense, right? If the oxygen's been used up, it frees up space for CO2 to hop on.
So it's like a swap meet oxygen off CO2 on. Pretty slick. But how does this bicarbonate conversion actually happen inside the red blood cells?
Good question. That's where the chloride shift comes into play.
Chloride shift. That sounds complicated.
Not really, once we break it down. Remember we talked about CO2 being converted into bicarbonate? Well, that all takes place inside the red blood cell with the help of a special enzyme called carbonic anhydrase.
So this carbonic anhydrase is like the key to the whole process.
Exactly. It speeds up the reaction between CO2 and water, forming carbonic acid. Then that carbonic acid quickly breaks down into hydrogen ions and those bicarbonate ions.
Okay, so CO2 enters the red blood cell, carbonic anhydrase does its thing, and we get bicarbonate. Then what?
Well, now we've got a bit of a crowding issue inside the red blood cell. All those bicarbonate ions need to go somewhere.
Right, enter the chloride shift. But seriously, what exactly is happening?
It's like a cellular exchange program. Bicarbonate ions start moving out of the red blood cell into the plasma, the liquid part of blood. But to keep things electrically balanced, chloride ions from the plasma have to move in. One-for-one swap.
So it's all carefully balanced.
Yep. And one cool consequence is that red blood cells in venous blood, the blood carrying the CO2, actually swell slightly compared to arterial blood.
Whoa, wait, so our red blood cells change size depending on how much CO2 they're carrying?
Exactly. All thanks to those chloride ions, which attract water, causing the red blood cells to plump up a bit.
Wow, I never knew there was so much going on in there.
Oh, it's amazing. And we haven't even talked about the alkali reserve yet.
Okay, alkali reserve, now that's a new one. What is that all about?
Think of it as your blood's pH bodyguard. It's the amount of CO2 present as bicarbonate in the arterial plasma, ready to neutralize any excess acid.
So it's like a buffer, keeping our blood from becoming too acidic.
Precisely. And it's crucial for not only transporting CO2, but also just keeping your blood pH balanced.
This is also fascinating. So we got physical solution, then chemical combination with bicarbonates and carbamino compounds, this chloride shift, and even alkali reserve. But what about when we actually need to exhale the CO2? How does all this work in reverse?
That's where the real beauty of this system comes in. But we will dive into that in just a bit.
Sounds like we have a lot more to uncover. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the fascinating world of CO2 transport.
All right, so we've seen how CO2 gets a makeover in the blood, but how does it actually exit the body? Well, think about it this way. All that CO2 is hitching a ride in your blood back to the lungs. right? And in the lungs, the situation is totally different. The partial pressure of CO2, like the CO2 crowd density, is way lower in the air sacs compared to your blood.
So it's like all those CO2 partygoers suddenly find themselves in a bigger room.
Exactly. And just like partygoers, they want to spread out, right? So the CO2 naturally flows from the crowded blood into those less crowded air sacs, ready to be exhaled.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about all that bicarbonate we talked about? Does that get converted back to CO2 too?
Absolutely. Our good friend carbonic anhydrase comes back into play. It's a two-way street, remember.
Huh.
In the lungs, where there's less CO2, carbonic anhydrase helps turn that bicarbonate back into carbonic acid, and then that breaks down into good old CO2 and water.
So carbonic anhydrase is like playing reverse musical chairs with those CO2 molecules.
I like that analogy. And as that CO2 is released, it diffuses into the air sacs, ready for you to breathe it out. Oh, and don't forget about the chloride shift.
The one where chloride ions move into the red blood cells when bicarbonate moves out?
Yeah, that whole process reverses too in the lungs.
Mm.
Bicarbonate back into the red blood cells, chloride back out.
Get it.
Got to keep everything balanced.
So it's like a constant back and forth driven by these changes in CO2 levels.
You got it. And here's another cool thing is CO2 is released from hemoglobin, that protein that carries oxygen. Well, that actually makes it easier for hemoglobin to pick up fresh oxygen from the lungs, thanks to the Haldane effect.
So it's win-win. We get rid of CO2 and our hemoglobin gets loaded up with oxygen. Amazing.
It really is. But I think what's even cooler is that this whole CO2 transport system isn't just about getting rid of waste. It's also vital for keeping our blood pH balanced.
Right. We talked about that with the alkali reserve. But how are CO2 transport and blood pH so connected?
Well, when CO2 is converted to bicarbonate, it also releases hydrogen ions, right? And those hydrogen ions can make the blood more acidic if they aren't controlled.
And that's where the bicarbonate steps in, acting as a buffer to neutralize those extra hydrogen ions.
Exactly. Bicarbonate ions are like tiny sponges soaking up those excess hydrogen ions and preventing any drastic changes in pH. Super important for maintaining that slightly alkaline pH of our blood around 7.4.
So it's all about balance, making sure we get rid of CO2, but also keep our blood pH in a healthy range.
Right on. And if that balance gets messed up, whether we produce too much CO2 or something goes wrong with the bicarbonate buffer, that's when we can have acid-base imbalances, which can be serious.
I see. So conditions like emphysema, which affect the lungs, could impact CO2 transport and blood pH.
You got it. Anything that affects our lungs, breathing, or even our kidneys, which regulate bicarbonate, can throw things off.
Wow, so many interconnected systems. It's a good reminder to keep those lungs and kidneys healthy. What about things like exercise? Does that affect CO2 transport?
Great question. When we exercise, our muscles work harder, produce more CO2, so the partial pressure of CO2 in our tissues goes up, creating a stronger push for CO2 to get into the blood and then out through the lungs.
So our bodies have to work harder to maintain that balance during exercise.
Exactly. But our bodies are awesome at adapting. That Haldane effect comes in clutch because our muscles are using more oxygen, so there's more deoxygenated hemoglobin ready to bind with CO2. Helps prevent the blood from becoming too acidic even when we're pushing ourselves.
So it's like our bodies are optimized for CO2 removal when we need it most.
Exactly. Another example of how brilliant our physiology is keeping us functioning at our best, even under stress.
This has been so insightful. We've learned so much about CO2 transport, those chemical conversions, the chloride shift, the Haldane effect even, and how it all keeps our bodies balanced. But before we wrap up, is there anything else about CO2 transport that might surprise our listeners?
Well, one thing that people are often amazed by is just the sheer volume of CO2 our bodies deal with every day. We're talking liters and liters of CO2 being transported and exhaled constantly, even while we sleep.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. That's a lot of CO2.
It is,
Yeah.
but it just shows how efficient our bodies are at handling this essential task.
This has been an incredible journey into the world of CO2 transport, from those different mechanisms to carbonic anhydrase and hemoglobin and the link between CO2 transport and blood pH.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure diving deep with you. And remember, folks, there's always more to learn about the amazing world inside our own bodies.
So true. We've covered a ton today, but there's always more to discover. Speaking of discoveries, Dr. Eldeeb's handout mentions something called tidal CO2. Can you tell us a bit more about that before we sign off?
So true. We've covered a ton today, but there's always more to discover. Speaking of discoveries, Dr. Eldeeb's handout mentions something called tidal CO2. Can you tell us a bit more about that before we sign off?
Oh yeah, tidal CO2. Remember how we've been talking about the difference in CO2 levels between the blood and the arteries and the veins?
Right.
Well, that difference, that's what we call tidal CO2. It's basically the amount that has to be transported out with each breath.
So it's kind of like the CO2 version of tidal volume, the amount
Yeah.
of air we breathe in and out.
I guess, Lee. It's a measure of how much CO2 needs to be removed to
Yeah.
keep everything balanced. And that difference, like we said earlier, is usually about 4 milliliters of CO2 per deciliter of blood.
Wow, so even that tiny difference needs this whole complex transport system.
It really shows how precise and efficient our bodies are, doesn't it? It really does. I think we've explored just about everything there is to know about CO2 transport for now.
Yeah, I think we've had a pretty thorough deep dive. We covered those two main ways. CO2 is transported physical solution and chemical combination. And we went into all the details of how bicarbonate is formed, the chloride shift, the Haldane effect, and how important the alkali reserve is for pH balance.
We even touched on how problems with the system like lung disease can cause those acid-base imbalances.
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey through the microscopic world of our blood and all the amazing things that happen to keep us alive and functioning.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks again to Dr. Rasha Eldeeb for that super informative physiology handout.
And to you, dear listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and interesting about CO2 transport.
It's amazing what our bodies do without us even realizing it. And remember, there's always more to discover. So keep those questions coming and join us next time for another deep dive.